All right, Star Trek Picard Season 2, Episode 3, Assimilation. Wait, assimilation? Who's gonna get assimilated? So anyway, I've been going through Season 2, and like I said, I thought the first two episodes were disappointingly subpar in quality, but it seems like this is the episode where we slip into something that seems to me at least to be a little more carefully written. The beginning of this episode feels like it's kind of the leftover of all the perfunctory stuff from the first two episodes, and then after that, it seems like we kind of transition into something that feels to me at least a little more carefully put together, my impression anyway. So we start off picking up from the cliffhanger from the last episode, where the grumpy old magistrate, aka Annika's angry husband, had beamed on board with some gray shirts and shot Elnor. But, well, tough luck on that magistrate. It seems he bit off a bit more than he bargained for. Because we get a little bit of the revenge of the angry middle-aged women, and after a little tanning of some hides, the girls finally reduce the guys to little specks of vapor, and then everybody can run around trying to save Elnor and trying to get the La Serena to outmaneuver the nasty old pursuers. And then there's a moment when everything kind of goes on pause for a minute. So Q can appear to Picard and say his line to Picard, and then kind of disappear like it was all a hallucination. Poor old Picard. So that line he said was, "This is the only kind of life you understand. Shall we see what else has been lost in the wake of your fear?" Okay, so I guess kind of like a repeat of what he said last episode when he showed Picard all the skulls. In a way, it's almost like a bit of a foreshadow of the Raffi anger that's going to make a bit of a splash in this episode. Seems like Q here is blaming Picard for everything bad that happens, kind of like Raffi does later. How that could exactly be justified is a bit hard to see, since Picard is more being pulled along by the story, I think, rather than actually making any judgment calls or making particular decisions. But Q and Raffi seem to disagree. Though you could say maybe Q is a bit more tongue-in-cheek here. He's more playing with Picard than anything. And Raffi later on, she's quite serious when she accuses him, but I think she's kind of more just channeling her frustrations at a convenient target without really thinking cogently about what she's saying. But then if you take that and add to that the unexpected anger that Jurati is going to express about Picard during her subconscious free speaking session later on, we'll get to that. But it almost ends up like a pattern in this episode that everybody's mad at Picard. But anyway, so the Borg Queen takes over the ship and blows up the bad guys with her Borgy, sciency magic trick, because we all know there are tons of those. And then after that, if you listen carefully, you can notice her chanting her magic spell. Move backward to go forward, shatter to mend, the past is now. And even though there's no wand in her hand, the incantation works its magic, and the La Serena does a Star Trek 4 around the sun to send it moving backward to go forward and to make the past the now. And then we get this really weird and quite lengthy time travel visualization, and oh, hello, it's time for the title sequence. So anyway, for what it's worth, I guess the choice of words for the Borg Queen's magic spell there may have a bit of a point to it. The paradoxical notion that sometimes the only way to go forward is to move backward, sometimes the only way to mend is to shatter, and sometimes the key to the present is the past. Move backward to go forward, shatter to mend, the past is now. Now, I'm not sure when the Queen got so poetic as to come up with all this altruistic verbiage, but in a way you could suggest that this whole season is about moving backward to go forward and shattering to mend. After all, sometimes just in life, we can become so fixated on progress and moving forward and trends and goals and hopes and dreams that we could get a little blind and trip over our own feet. And sometimes part of the answer could be in the direction of what seems to be the opposite of progress, the past. And I guess historically speaking, this idea of the valuable backward glance is sort of the spirit of the Renaissance, we could say, returning to ancient things that may have been dismissed long ago for unsatisfactory reasons. For the same token, it's also the spirit of the original humanism. While modern secular humanism is identified primarily as a particular set of moral values that harness the core of pro-social dignity within humanity, usually within an atheistic or a non-theistic framework. But in contrast, the original humanists in the 13th to the 16th centuries were identified primarily by their admiration for the great classical works of humanity that had sunk into the past and been forgotten, such as the works of the Greek philosophers and other forgotten classics, so that humanism in its original form was not a morality or a framework for life, but rather a kind of self-conscious backward exploration trying to restore lost beauty, the lost dignity and nobility of humanity that deserves a chance to shape our thinking today. And both kinds of humanism, I think, are a core assumption playing in the background of most of Star Trek. Now, I'm not sure the writers necessarily meant a whole lot by the Queen's words here, especially since this is in that part of the episode prior to the point where I've tended to think of the more thoughtful quality content really starting. But still, it's a fun little cryptic phraseology that puts the whole thrust of the whole season into a nice little witty maxim. And I think it's also kind of cool how it embodies the spirit of the Renaissance and the kind of open-minded, exploratory spirit that we tend to see throughout Star Trek. Many of these Star Trek captains, for example, will often be found quoting real-world classics with shocking familiarity, especially Picard in The Next Generation. I think the most well-known instance of this would probably be his Moby Dick quotations in First Contact. But captains are always quoting classics or reading through classic books or making references to Greek philosophers or ancient mythology. And when they aren't referencing real life classic literature, they're making similar comments about mythology or classic literature from alien cultures. So that even when it's not real life stuff, the attitude is still the same kind of Renaissance humanist mentality of valuing the past as one of the most important parts of moving forward as a society and culture and as an individual. In a similar vein, that second part of the phrase, shatter to mend. While the Queen is thinking of trying to mend the timeline and return wholeness to the space-time continuum, when I think of that phrase in light of the above comments I just made about the Renaissance mindset and stuff like that, it definitely makes me think about how, for any philosophical or religious or ideological tradition, shattering to mend often plays a pivotal role in the most significant kinds of forward progress, or if you will, the backward to go forward progress. And I guess you could say, if that's the spirit of Renaissance, you could say this is kind of the spirit of Reformation, which is a term that most of us primarily associate with the Protestant Reformation, which followed the Renaissance, but in the more explicitly religious sphere. But it's been observed that all major religions have usually not just one, but multiple instances of something like a reformation, when there's a combination of recognizing that things have gotten displaced from where they ought to be, and then that there's also some kind of corruption or error or harm being done to people, or all of the above. And so the impurities need to be removed. And usually that's going to happen by some kind of look back, by some kind of return to the source or sources or the most important foundational elements of the movement or system or whatever it is. And shattering to mend is often the only way that the more purified form is going to actually be able to get into the healthy place it needs to be in. In the Star Trek world, this is what happened in Enterprise Season 4 when the Vulcans discovered the Kirshara, the ancient sacred text that contained the authentic teachings of Surak. The Vulcans at that point really had to go backward to move forward. True progress at that point for the Vulcans wasn't going to be by coming up with some new ideas that no one had ever heard of, but by discovering ancient ones that had been abandoned for all the wrong reasons, which had been abandoned, we could say, probably mostly for political, self-promoting, greed-motivated reasons that were probably fundamentally immoral in nature, much like the maddening political churning that we see within the power structure of Bajoran religion in Deep Space Nine. And also, all too much like what can happen in the real world within every kind of academic or religious or ideological or in any other way purportedly truth-seeking institution with humans in it. Because in some cases, what would seem to be progress or the moving forward can actually be more connected with power politics and personality conflicts than any actual warrant or basis for making a change or maintaining that change, or for refusing to make a change, or for refusing to maintain a change. But the Vulcans were able to find their way to this more accurate commitment to Surak and to true logic, find their way to the best understanding of what the transcendent ideal of capital L logic should actually be thought of as being. They found that not just by moving forward, but by moving backward to go forward, and by shattering to mend. There was upheaval and a lot of hatred coming from the political power brokers, but the end result was a better, stronger, more dignified, more worthy form of Vulcan culture that was actually far closer to the more fundamental and more intrinsic ideal of what is actually truly and deeply Vulcan in the most important ways. In a similar way, in this season of Star Trek Picard, Q has created a situation in which Picard is forced to move backward so that he can come to better understand himself and his family and his ancestry and what pertains to him personally, as well as to better understand what makes society and the Federation and the universe and the galaxy better or worse. What's the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, hope and joy, despair and futility? The keys to the present and future, both for Picard personally and for humanity as a whole, are to be found not just in creativity or spontaneous insight or sequential stacking up of innovations, Certainly not to be found in bowing to the politically motivated caprice of cultural and intellectual trends, but rather in the careful and reverent observation and exploration of the past. The destiny of Earth, as well as Picard himself personally in this episode, goes backward to move forward, shatters to mend, as he returns to his own childhood and his own pain and finds greater wholeness in the aftermath. So anyway, maybe I'm getting a bit carried away here for this part. I don't necessarily think the creators meant all that or even necessarily meant any of that. It wouldn't surprise me if it was just a throwaway line, but it's still just kind of cool to explore the Star Trek themes that come up in light of that and the real life things that connect to that in light of that odd sounding line that came out of the mouth of the most unlikely character who seems to be giving a lot of altruistic, poetic sounding things like seek the watcher and stuff. But anyway, so next, they need to make a targeted crash, quote unquote. So Picard asks for control, and then he guides the ship down. I'm pretty sure he guides it down to his vineyard, but I don't think they've shown that in this episode. I think they reveal that later. But I've only seen the season once before now, so I could be wrong about that. But and then we found out that the Queen, who is now unconscious, is diverting power to keep herself alive, which is going to result in Elnor dying because there's not enough power to sickbay. There's a bit of an interesting ethical dilemma in that moment when they consider killing the queen to regain the ship. And part of what makes it interesting is because Elnor dies, and we realize they could have saved Elnor by killing the queen. In fact, Rios was seconds away from shooting her, except that Picard stopped him and said, "We need her," and Rios hesitated, but then he finally put away his phaser, and then Elnor died. And then it was after that, after all the action kind of died down, and there was kind of a quiet moment of reflective pausing after all the tension had let up and the characters were just kind of pausing in the quiet of it all. And it was during that quiet moment that I thought to myself, and I jotted down in my notes as I was watching, I wrote down, "I'm guessing and hoping this is about the point where Cheese Picard stops and the more interesting story begins." And then I said, I guess I'm just thinking that because the cheese action has stopped and Picard and the others are looking a little more reflective. And the last of the gotta get this out of the way setup elements has finished, the time travel and the death of Elnor. So that's what I wrote in that moment. And now in retrospect, I think that's pretty much how I feel about it. I think starting with that ethical dilemma about whether to save the Borg Queen, so I guess just a little bit before that quiet reflective pause, but starting about then, the story very suddenly becomes much more interesting and almost like it's supposed to be a thoughtful and meaningful story. The annoying part has ended, and the rest of the episode I really, really enjoyed. And based on my memory from my first run through of the season years back, I think I'm going to love the rest of the season. Now, season three, on the other hand, unfortunately, at least based on my first run through a year or so ago, kept up the annoying stuff until like halfway through the season, or at least that's how I felt my first run through. We'll see if I still feel that way next time I go through it. But for this season, season two at least, once we get into episode three, where once all the loose threads from the first two episodes have all been tied up, then there's a whole season to sit back and enjoy. Um, so I guess killing the Borg Queen is an interesting ethical dilemma because, like I pointed out last episode, the Queen is one of the most quintessentially evil entities within the whole Star Trek universe. You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who disagrees that the world would be a far better place without her running around anywhere. Notwithstanding all of her eyebrow-raising poetic verbiage like shatter to mend and seek the watcher. While Picard elsewhere affirms the Starfleet ethic of never killing anybody in any situation for any reason. His reasoning here isn't so much that. It's not that we should have compassion on the Borg Queen and we can't be guilty of killing her, in which case, if he said that, Rios would probably have just shouted a couple curse words and blasted her to bits. But instead, here, it was a pragmatic line of reasoning that Picard gave. We need her. So, the classical ethical question of killing one person to save another, that perennial classroom question, it's kind of turned on its head here a little bit because the person you would be killing is irrevocably evil and has committed mass atrocities and has confident plans to go back to doing that as soon as possible. But the downside is you have a complicated plan to use this person to eventually bring about some good. And then also, just like with every kill one person to save another ethical dilemma, one of the biggest sources of trouble here is that it's not actually a binary choice, since you never know if and when that dying person who needs to be saved is actually going to die. So they make their decision, but it's not like they had a multiple choice questionnaire and they checked the box. It's more like their indecision took Elnor's life. Their waiting or their passivity or their failure to do something that could have changed the course for him. And of course, that's sometimes how life works. Sometimes you feel that you can't act. And sometimes maybe you actually do have your hands tied, but other times you may just feel paralyzed when you aren't. But either way, passivity or waiting or not moving fast enough, not feeling able to take that hard plunge can result in just mountains of consequences, one after another, that kind of hunt you down for your hesitancy. As the maxim goes, you make the decision by not making the decision, by continuing to not quit your horrible job, for example, by continuing not to confront that one person who needs to be confronted, by continuing to not write that clarifying email, by continuing to not report that crime, by continuing to, you get the point. Anyway, so here we recognize that neither Picard nor anyone else said, let's kill Elnor to save the Borg Queen in hopes that we can save humanity. And we do also definitely recognize a different level of culpability for a good action not done than for a bad action actually done. And particularly, you'll probably think that way if you understand there to be a deontological aspect to ethics. In other words, meaning that actions can have an intrinsic moral quality in and of themselves. But we also recognize, in addition to that, that people like Rios and Raffi are going to look at Picard and see somebody who, for all practical purposes, made an exchange that they would never have made, and which seems to be an exchange of a good person's life for the life of a corrupt perpetrator of unthinkable evil who can get you something that you want. Anyway, so next up here, Raffi takes out her anger in this dialogue slash monologue against Picard, basically saying that all the bad things that have happened are all his fault. And then there's a mention of the Watcher as the next thing that they're going to have to be looking for. And then it occurs to Raffi that fixing the timeline could possibly bring Elnor back. And so Raffi starts rushing off to go try to find the Watcher on her own. And Picard kind of turns halfway toward the others and says, she's too emotional. Too much could go wrong. And Seven nods and says, I'll go with her. Rios says, me too. It's kind of an odd choice of words for Picard to use. She's too emotional. I think maybe we could say what he means to say is that she's in a physiological fight or flight state and she isn't thinking clearly because she's really refusing to take the time to process her feelings or even to become fully aware of them. And so a convenient shorthand is she's too emotional. I think that line would make a lot more sense for the old Picard back in the Next Generation days, back when he was more of an unemotional person in terms of his own personality and his way of viewing the world and stuff. I think the changes in his personality ever since the beginning of Star Trek Picard make that more of an odd way for Picard to express himself at this point here. Seems to me that taking an attitude in general in life, taking an attitude of affirmation and acceptance toward emotions within yourself and in others, is the kind of thing that tends to make you less likely to use phrases like too emotional to refer to somebody losing control. Because emotions themselves are a good thing rather than a bad thing. And loss of control isn't usually from having too many emotions or too much emotion, but from failing to understand or know your own emotions, or from the actual physiological fight or flight process and the resultant brain state connected with adrenaline and stuff like that, which is sometimes referred to as flooding, but which isn't synonymous with just having too many emotions. When you're flooded, you feel compelled toward radical action in categories of fighting or fleeing or freezing. Hence, Raffi runs off to try to take action within the fight category. She just can't sit still. She has to get out and tackle the issues with these intense bursts of effort and energy. But flooding also makes you blind to things that don't seem relevant to that fight or flight state of your mind, which is why stuff like calm discussion, negotiation, compassion, empathy, and other interpersonal skills tend to go right out the window when somebody's flooded. So maybe this choice of words, she's too emotional, could be thought of as a throwback kind of vocabulary default that Picard defaults to as a verbal habit from his earlier, less emotionally aware, less pro-emotion days. Which is the kind of thing that does tend to happen when someone's gone through significant changes of beliefs or focuses or personality. There can tend to be things left over that remain unchallenged or unchanged in the back of your head just because they're so default and so reflexive in terms of how they're used and what they're there for. So maybe we could just say that when Picard gets that uncomfortable feeling as he sees Raffi running off and his instinct forces him to say something ASAP to keep bad things from happening, we could say that in that moment of instinct, he kind of reverts to the automatic choice of words that he would have defaulted to over past decades. She's too emotional, meaning simply Oh, there she goes. Trouble's coming. She's not in control, you know. So anyway, so the story goes on. As Jurati talks, she ends up making a passing reference to this time frame being 400 years in the past, which I think is kind of a nice little reference point for us. If we want, we can take that and we can measure things out for an interesting comparison. If we're talking 400 years, then that means the gap between Picard and Friends in 2024 is comparable to the gap between us today and 1624. So if you think about 1624, that would be 130 years after Columbus discovered the New World. It'd be less than 10 years after the death of Shakespeare, about 20 years after the death of Queen Elizabeth I. It would be a century into the Protestant Reformation, and it'd be less than 20 years after the completion of the King James Bible. So the gap between Picard and Friends and us is comparable to the gap between us and Shakespeare, Queen Elizabeth, and King James. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Well, anyway, so Picard decides that while they search, he'll try to revive the Borg Queen since she may have some info about who the Watcher is and where she is and why they should find her. We get an interesting line as Picard and Jurati discuss the nature of the neural connection that you have when you're connected with the Borg. She asks how much control or influence or whatever Picard had back when he was a Borg, and he answers indirectly by saying, I felt an intense euphoria, but no sense of my own existence. So he kind of answers the other question, what he feels is the more important question to what Jurati should be asking. And he says, I felt this intense euphoria, but no sense of my own existence. And I kind of like that description. I think it also kind of implies and comes alongside a lot of the subtopics that Star Trek episodes tend to nod toward by how they discuss the Borg. The Borg, or the disregard for individuality, as Voyager often talks about. In Voyager, it's often individuality versus the collective or versus the loss of the individual. But so the Borg, or the disregard for individuality, is kind of like gaining the whole world and losing your soul, in the same sense as what happened to the Talosians from the unaired pilot of the original series, The Cage. If you remember, the Talosians' mental powers were referred to as basically a narcotic that gradually took away all the drives that lead to culture and progress and ordinary human life for the Talosians. So the Borg trap is kind of like the Talosian trap. It's losing your actual self, your individuality, your life as life, and getting pleasure instead, euphoria. Not unlike drug addiction, not unlike a life entirely spent passively binging Netflix, not unlike the alcoholic who works a dead end 9 to 5 job and comes home to play video games, maybe have a half coherent drunken party, and then have a hangover and repeat. We could say the Talosian trap is the unreal wiping out the real. And we could say the Borg trap is the composite or the system wiping out the self. And we could say both of them are pleasure wiping out meaning. And those are all pretty real life traps. Anyway, so Jurati suggests her linking up with the Queen, since it'd be safer for her to do it than for Picard, since Picard would be quicker to assimilate, since she already knows his mind based on whatever alternate timeline version of Locutus she would have some memories of. Meanwhile, it is decided that the team of Raffi, Rios, and Seven should head off and try to find the highest tower nearby so they can scan from there. And then as they are getting ready to head out, there's a short little interesting moment when Raffi bumps into Seven to take care of something. And Raffi refuses to give Seven a chance to offer her a chance to talk about Elnor. She just interrupts Seven and says, what I want is to try to figure out how to fix the timeline and not talk about how it felt to watch him die. So it looks like she's in a pretty strong and pretty clear inner avoidance mode. Avoidance in the sense of avoiding rather than letting yourself experience your own feelings. In this case, it's also overlapping with the first, second, and third of these stages of grief: denial, anger, and bargaining. I'm talking about the 5 Kubler-Ross stages of grief, which aren't actually stages and they don't necessarily go in order, but they're denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. It seems like Raffi is hoping she'll never have to face those feelings. If she can just get Elnor back, then she won't ever have to face the inner pain that's tearing her apart. And as far as real life goes, even if it wasn't a possibility that she could use time travel to undo things, It's just sometimes a lot easier to keep squeezing more juice out of your adrenaline than to turn toward the most terrifying thing there is during a crisis. The most terrifying thing is facing the feelings you have inside that you haven't yet been able to fully experience. Those feelings that have been causing the most shock. In this case, the grief and agony and impact of seeing him die. A lot of us have this distinctively useful ability to keep running in high function mode during and immediately after a crisis. But what Raffi's avoiding is this awareness that the moment that adrenaline settles down, she knows she'll be hit by something like a crisis hangover, as it were. That part where everything just piles on you, and all that pain is never going to feel half as good as this adrenaline that you've still got. And the fear is that really going there would take you so low, as it seems to the person, it would take you so low that you'd never get out of it again. And therefore, she practices avoidance. And not just avoidance in the ordinary grief kind of sense, but specifically in relation to the crisis type experience in which the grief has a traumatic aspect. And the ordinary grief tendency toward denial, anger, and bargaining, or trying every last ditch effort to fix things, these are amplified because in this time travel universe, maybe she really can undo Elnor's death. Maybe her denial can actually become reality. So anyway, a bunch of heavy stuff there, and time travel definitely makes a bit of a mess out of the grieving process, that's for sure. But then there's one little humorous moment that just made me laugh out loud just shortly after that. So this is the next scene. We jump over to Jurati and Picard again, and Jurati just kind of comes up slowly to Picard, and after a pause, she just kind of says, "It's only a partial assimilation." And I just had to laugh out loud just because of the way it was said and the way it came out. Just so priceless. It's almost as good as when Vina in the cage, the first episode of the original series, when she says about the Telosians when Pike's got, his hands around the guy's neck and she's like, "They don't mean to be evil." Somebody's got to just like take these two lines together and put them together in a Facebook meme that says something like, "Come on, Daddy, it's only a partial assimilation. They don't mean to be evil." But anyway, Picard gives a pretty good witty rejoinder. He says, "Halfway to hell is still not a recommended destination." Nice one, Jean-Luc. Makes you wonder if Picard wasn't just very recently reading through some Dante, since he also made a reference last episode to the circles of hell. So anyway, yeah, I think that's actually Picard. So next up, the three beam down after Picard gives them a final warning about not interfering with the timeline. They beam in at random places, but Rios beams in midair and falls and gets hurt. And someone finds him and takes him into the clinic, and his comm badge falls off, and a little kid gets it. And then we get the really cool scene back on the ship as Jurati tries to reach into the mind of the Borg Queen. It's not the first time Star Trek characters have dove into somebody else's mind. It reminds me of O'Brien and Bashir back in DS9 invading the mind of the Section 31 operative Sloan, which was also a very dangerous proposition. But that one was portrayed differently on screen than this one was. Here, instead of giving us a metaphorical visual for the progress, they instead let her subconscious mind be talking out loud with Picard, which I think is really quite a cool touch. Very fun to watch. Also, I found it interesting, partway through this process, in passing, her subconscious self accuses Picard of having no feelings, but pretending to have feelings for social reasons. I'm not quite sure what to make of this. Is this Jurati simply misunderstanding him, or are the writers trying to retcon this version of Picard back to the older version of Picard? Since I think Raffi also made similar unfeeling accusations when she was giving him her angry rant earlier. Or maybe what Jurati is subconsciously angry about is just kind of this invulnerability aspect of Picard, in that Picard doesn't tend to lose control. I don't know. And something to plug into this as well is that just the nature of the ethical dilemma I mentioned earlier with Elnor and Picard's very quick decision not to kill the Queen could be seen as a cold decision. So maybe Picard's decisiveness as a practiced leader could be part of what causes some people to think of him as unfeeling, especially if you combine that with the fact that he doesn't seem to ever lose control or even to have to really agonize over those kinds of decisions. Anyway, so Rios meets Teresa in the clinic, and Seven and Raffi manage to get up to the tower to scan. And it's kind of funny, Raffi's tricorder is literally a fat phone. It looks exactly like the kind of phone I might use. That's a fat phone that chirps. I thought that was kind of funny. And Seven is surprised that strangers seem to like her. because she's so used to being disliked because of her Borg implants, which she doesn't have right now. Meanwhile, Rios almost gets his comm badge back, but then Teresa confiscates it and says she'll keep it up front so he doesn't steal anything. Back to Picard and Jurati, the Queen wakes up, and Picard tries to reason with her, but the Queen demands a ship before she'll give them any information. But when Jurati wakes up, we find that Jurati already stole those coordinates straight out of the Queen's mind. So the Queen is thwarted for now, but Jurati knows there's still more info the Queen has. And then Picard rushes Jurati away, recognizing the slimy subtlety of the Queen's deceit and manipulation. And I'm pretty sure Picard does that. He rushes her away right after the Queen says that Jurati impresses her. And probably because Picard at that point suddenly realizes, if I remember right, it's kind of like an aha moment pops into Picard's head when he's suddenly alarmed by that comment, that seemingly innocuous comment. I think Picard suddenly realizes that the Queen is playing a very complicated mind game, and that the Queen now knows Jurati's mind from having that telepathic connection. The Queen in Picard Season 2 would be an interesting case study in deceptive manipulation tactics. And as Picard realizes here, in some cases, your only realistic course of action is to actually stop listening in certain cases, which is the kind of behavior that in ordinary cases would be unthinkable and kind of unjust. Soji learned the same thing in regard to Narek in season one, that he's so good at coming up with slimy combinations of truth and lies and appeals to everything he knows about her, that really her only way to maintain her sanity is to not listen, even if he could be telling the truth. Anyway, so next, back to the clinic, immigration officers show up. Rios tries to go up front to help Teresa. He really just wants his comm badge, I think. But then he gets taken in by immigration. And the episode ends with, as they drag him off, ends with Picard's voice coming through the comm badge that's sitting there next to the plate of cookies. Picard to Rios, Picard to Rios. And they drag him off. And there we are waiting eagerly for the next episode. Anyway, so yeah, I think I'm gonna keep on thinking of this episode as the episode after the cheese dross of the first two episodes. It'd be interesting to find out what happened behind the scenes to make such a visible transition of story quality. Or maybe nothing in particular happened, but they just made the first two episodes with sloppier, hastier story writing. Or maybe the first two episodes were them trying out a more pulp fiction action story kind of style to test it out and see how the audience responded to it. I don't know. But anyway, at this point, I'm glad to be back into a more engaging kind of story as we pick up with this episode and get to move on through the rest of the season. So I'll see you in the next one and enjoy picking up with discussing episode 4. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end here. If you want more videos that touch on the overlap where sci-fi and fantasy meet with things like psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, then make sure you hit that subscribe button. But I will see you in the next one.